What you are about to hear is not the story of explorers or kings or the names that ended up on continents. This is the story of the men and women who stood behind those people, who shaped them patiently in rooms that history chose to forget. The one who raised the people who ruled the world. This is Hands of History. Tonight, the governess. Somewhere in Europe, in any century you care to choose, there was a child at a desk and an adult sitting across from it. Between them, there was a book, or a map, or a page of Latin grammar that the child would rather not look at. The adult was not the child's parent. The adult was paid. And what passed between them in those hours shaped the person that child would become. The ideas introduced, the habits of mind formed, the particular way of looking at a problem that would remain long after the lesson was over. Which is to say, it shaped the world. To understand what these people did, you first have to understand where they stood, and where they stood was nowhere that the social order had properly accounted for. The governess, or the male tutor, who was her rough equivalent in other households, existed in a kind of permanent social parenthesis. They were the people who possessed the education and bearing of one class and the economic reality of another, and whose lives were defined by the gap between those two things. She came, typically, from a family that had once been prosperous, or was still precariously so. She had read the same books as the lady of the house, could carry a conversation in French, understood the correct way to address a bishop, and the difference between a formal call and a genuine invitation. Her manners were the manners of a lady, because that was what she was, or had been, or might have been under other circumstances. But she was also paid a salary, and in the world she moved through, that single fact placed her beneath the family in a way that no amount of education or refinement could undo. The position she found herself in had no proper name and no comfortable place at any table. Literally, she did not eat with the servants, who regarded her as a creature from a different world. And she did not eat with the family, who could not acknowledge her as an equal. Without disturbing an arrangement everyone preferred to leave intact. The Victorians, characteristically, addressed this not as a problem, but as a condition. A household manual from 1840 advised young women entering the profession to consider, before accepting any position, whether they were capable of enduring the solitude that the role would inevitably bring. The loneliness was not a regrettable side effect. It was part of the job description. The tutor occupied a slightly different version of the same arrangement. He was often a younger son of a modest family, or a man of genuine scholarly ability, who had no inherited income to translate that ability into independence. A clergyman waiting for a living, a university graduate who had discovered that a good degree offered no particular guarantee of employment. A tutor, being male and credentialed, was accorded a certain professional respect that his female equivalent was rarely offered. Although the practical reality of his position was not, in most other respects, meaningfully different. He was still, in the essential sense, a guest who was also an employee, which meant he was neither quite a guest nor quite an employee, and fully at home in neither role. What both of them shared, across centuries and across very different households, was this: they came to the house with knowledge, and they left it with nothing that showed. No title, no property, no monument, no entry in any record that mattered. The children they shaped grew up and married and inherited and governed. And the person who had first put a book in front of them vanished from the record as quietly as they had entered the household. The official duties were clear enough: languages, mathematics, history, music, the elements of drawing and letter writing. The social skills that would allow a child to move through the world without embarrassing the family that had paid for the privilege. These were the visible, measurable outputs of a home education, and they were the reason families hired someone in the first place. But the unofficial work, the work that actually mattered in the long run, was something far harder to specify and far more consequential than any lesson plan. What the governess and the tutor did in the long, unstructured hours of a child's formation was to be the first adult mind that child encountered at close quarters. Not a parent who was too close and too loaded with feeling to be truly formative in the same way, and not a schoolmaster who was too distant and too busy with a roomful of other children. The governess had access to a child's attention during the years when attention is most elastic, when the habits of thought that will last a lifetime are not yet habits, only tendencies, only the beginnings of a shape. Most of what a person becomes is decided early, before formal education has had much chance to take hold, before the world has offered enough resistance to reveal who someone actually is. The habits of thought, the moral reflexes, the instinct for how to behave when the answer isn't obvious, these form through daily proximity to another mind. Through watching how someone else approaches a problem, through years of small repeated examples rather than any single lesson. The governess was present for exactly those years. It made what they did less like teaching and more like quietly shaping the person who would later have to make decisions that mattered. A Swiss tutor named Frédéric César de la Harpe arrived at the Russian imperial court in 1784, brought in by Catherine the Great to educate her grandson Alexander, who was 7 years old at the time. La Harpe was a trained lawyer from the canton of Vaud, a Republican by conviction. A man who had absorbed the political philosophy of the Enlightenment and believed in it with the intensity of someone who had never had power of his own. Over the following decade, he taught the boy history, philosophy, and the ideas of Rousseau. The notion that power should be accountable, that governance was a responsibility rather than a right, that a ruler owed something to the people he ruled rather than the other way around. He did this in the Winter Palace of St. Petersburg, inside the most absolute monarchy in Europe, with a child who would one day sit on its throne. That child grew up to be Tsar Alexander I. He defeated Napoleon at the height of Napoleon's power. He helped redraw the map of Europe at the Congress of Vienna. And decades after La Harpe had left the Russian court, Alexander wrote to his former tutor to tell him that he was the only man who had ever shown him what virtue actually looked like in practice. La Harpe spent the later years of his life in comfortable obscurity, protected by the quiet intervention of a former pupil who had become the most powerful ruler on the continent. But no account of the Napoleonic era begins with La Harpe's name. He is a footnote in someone else's story, which is the fate almost every person in his position shared. In the summer of 1548, a woman stood on a dock at Dumbarton Castle and waited for a French galley to carry her, and the child in her care across the sea to a country she had never visited, in a language she did not speak. She was 45 years old, recently widowed. Her husband had been killed the previous year at the Battle of Pinkie Cloche, and she had several children of her own. She had been given, by the Scottish court, responsibility for a 5-year-old girl who happened to be Queen of Scotland. Her name was Janet Stuart, and she would be known in France before long as Lady Fleming, and then by a third name the French court gave her, La Belle Écossaise, the beautiful Scotswoman. She was the illegitimate daughter of King James IV, which made her the half-aunt of the child she was escorting. Every account that survives suggests she was a woman of extraordinary personal presence, charming and direct, and largely unbothered by the social hierarchies that constrained everyone around her. A Venetian ambassador, who encountered her at the French court, described her in language that belonged more to a portrait than a diplomatic dispatch. The French noticed her immediately, and not only because she arrived in their midst, speaking nothing but Scots, and apparently feeling no particular embarrassment about this. A scholar named Giovanni Ferrerio, writing anxiously back to Scotland, worried that Lady Fleming's lack of French or Latin would make it impossible for her to communicate with French physicians if the child fell ill. Mary was a fragile child in a court that was vast and indifferent, and her Scottish blood, however royal, counted for little in Valois, France. Ferrerio hoped a Scottish doctor could be appointed. What he did not anticipate was that Lady Fleming would adapt to her surroundings faster than anyone had expected, and in a rather more spectacular way than anyone had planned. By 1550, the building accounts of the Château de Saint-Germain-en-Laye noted iron reinforcements being fitted to the governess's chamber, which is the kind of detail that tells historians more than it appears to. At court, the Constable Montmorency had been seen visiting Lady Fleming's rooms rather frequently, until it emerged that Montmorency was not the point. He was the cover. The man actually coming to see her was Henry II. The affair ran into 1551, and at some point during it, Henry wrote to Mary of Guise in Scotland to say that Lady Fleming was showing the most admirable devotion to the young Queen's welfare. It was a letter with a great deal going on beneath the surface. By early 1551, Janet was pregnant. The child was the King's, and the court responded with the speed and ruthlessness that courts tend to reserve for problems of this particular kind. Catherine de' Medici was furious. Diane de Poitiers, the king's official mistress, was furious in a manner that was more controlled and therefore more dangerous. The Guise brothers, who had a proprietary interest in Mary's education and therefore in the reputation of everyone associated with it, were furious in their own particular way. Janet Fleming had made the one mistake that her position could not absorb. She had become impossible to ignore. In October 1551, she was sent back to Scotland. Her replacement was a French courtier named Françoise de Parois, selected by Catherine de' Medici herself, which says something about who was now making decisions about the Scottish Queen's household. The son Janet had borne to the king was named Henri d'Angoulême. Henry acknowledged him, legitimized him, gave him titles. He went on to become governor of Provence and admiral of the Levant, and he lived until 1586. His mother returned to Scotland and largely vanishes from the historical record. A letter from Mary of Guise in 1552 mentions her situation and notes that someone had proposed marrying her to a military advisor. Whether this happened is not recorded. She died in 1562 at 59, having spent the most consequential years of her life in the service of a child who was not her own, in a country that was not hers, navigating a court that had no adequate category for what she actually was. The child she had escorted across the sea grew up to marry the Dauphin of France. She became, briefly, Queen of two kingdoms. She returned to Scotland, made a series of decisions that history has argued about ever since, and was executed in England at the age of 44. Mary, Queen of Scots, is remembered in extraordinary and sometimes exhausting detail. Janet Fleming, who crossed the water with her and held the household together in those first years at the French court, is a footnote in accounts of someone else's life, which is, as it turns out, the most accurate summary of what a governess's career could expect to amount to. Success in this work had a strange quality. The better you were at it, the less trace you left. The best governess was the one who effaced herself so completely that the work she had done appeared, in retrospect, to have done itself. When a child grew up poised and well-read and capable of holding a conversation in 3 languages, the credit accumulated to the family's breeding, the child's own intelligence, perhaps the general atmosphere of cultivation in the household. The person who had actually been present every morning for a decade tended not to enter the accounting. This was not a failure of memory, so much as a feature of the arrangement. The governess was engaged to produce a result, not to be remembered for producing it. The moment a tutor inspired too fierce a devotion in his pupil, or a governess became too central to the emotional life of the household, something shifted. The family grew uncomfortable, the lines became unclear, and the professional found herself suddenly, and sometimes without warning, in the position of having overstepped. the inverse was equally unreliable. If the governess kept herself small enough, professionally invisible enough, she risked a different kind of erasure. The erasure that came at the end of the engagement, when the children were old enough for school or the world, and she was released with a reference letter and the requirement to begin again somewhere else. There was no pension attached to 10 years of reliable service. There was no acknowledgement that a portion of one family's formation had passed through her hands. There was, if she was fortunate, a warm letter, and if she was luckier still, an occasional note from a former charge who had grown up and not entirely forgotten. Françoise de Maintenon understood the dynamics of her position with an acuity that bordered on the strategic. She had been employed as governess to the illegitimate children of Louis XIV and his mistress, Madame de Montespan. She was clever, composed, and devout in a manner that the king found, over time, increasingly compelling. When Montespan fell from favor, Maintenon did not fall with her. She rose steadily, carefully, over years, first into the king's confidence, and then into something closer than confidence. Until sometime around 1683, they were married in a private ceremony that the court was not officially informed of, and the king never publicly acknowledged. It was the most complete transformation in the history of the profession, and it was so exceptional that it illuminates, rather than contradicts, the general rule. For every Maintenon, there were thousands of women who simply worked, grew older in other people's houses, and were not remembered. Women who had taught the children of earls and country squires the names of rivers and the conjugations of Latin verbs, who had corrected handwriting and supervised piano practice and watched their charges grow up and leave. That was what the work came to. By the Victorian era, the governess had become so embedded in the structure of middle-class and upper-class life that she had also become, almost without anyone intending it, one of the period's most prolific private writers. Not professional writers in the main, not published authors or celebrated memoirists, but writers in the sense that people become writers when they have long evenings with no company and things they need to put somewhere. The letters and journals left behind by Victorian governesses have survived in quantities that historians find remarkable, and they constitute a body of social observation unlike almost anything else from the period. Part of what makes them remarkable is the particular vantage point they record. The governess occupied a position inside the family that was also always slightly outside it. She was present for the arguments and the tenderness and the small daily cruelties. And still, she had no standing within any of it, no voice in any of the decisions, no role in the story, except as a kind of stage manager who would be thanked, if she was thanked, in the final act and then written out. In 1851, England had somewhere in the region of 25,000 women employed as governesses, a number that gives some sense of how thoroughly the profession had woven itself into the fabric of Victorian domestic life. Each of them was living the same structural situation in her particular household, and the private writing they produced tends to circle the same set of experiences regardless of the decade or the county or the specific family involved. The loneliness they describe is of a very particular kind, not the loneliness of solitude, since most of them were surrounded by children and household noise every day, but the loneliness of proximity without belonging, of knowing a family's rhythms and secrets and small private language, and having no standing to be part of any of it. The Bronte sisters, all three of whom worked as governesses at various points, drew directly and extensively on what they had seen from that position. Jane Eyre was not an invented condition. It was a documented one. The intelligence, the powerlessness, the dignity maintained under circumstances that were not designed to accommodate it. Charlotte Bronte had lived all of that before she wrote a word of it down. The novel was, in a very real sense, what happened when a governess was finally given a chance to speak at full volume. Most of them were not. Most of them wrote letters instead, carefully and slowly, sometimes spending an entire evening on a single page, because a letter was company. It was also proof that they existed somewhere beyond the household that employed them, that there was a world outside it that still knew their name. There is a version of history organized around decisions. The moment a general chose one road over another, the night a treaty was signed, the morning an explorer turned a ship westward into open water. And then there is a slower, less dramatic history, the history of formation, of the years before the decisions were made. The rooms and the voices and the habits of mind that shaped the people who would eventually be the ones making choices that mattered. The governess inhabited that second history almost entirely. They were the infrastructure of consequence, present at the beginning of things. Janet Fleming crossed the sea to care for a child who was not her own, in a language she had not learned, and was sent home when her presence became inconvenient. La Harpe spent more than a decade forming the mind of a future Tsar, and spent the rest of his life dependent on that former pupil's goodwill. Thousands of women, whose names have not been preserved, taught other people's children how to read and think and carry themselves through a world that had been arranged for someone else's benefit. Thousands of women, whose names have not been preserved, taught other people's children how to read and think and carry themselves through a world that had been arranged for someone else's benefit. They left themselves in people. It was the only place history had left room for them. That was Hands of History. Next time, we go back inside another room, another profession, another person history forgot to name. If this is where you want to return, subscribe. We will be here. Until next time, sleep well.